On this episode of the show, I have with me Brad Holden. He is managing partner at Protocol VC, and we're going to be talking about the cyclical nature of crypto. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, how it's complementary to AI, and some of the challenges and opportunities in evaluating crypto opportunities as, I'm sure Brad gets a lot of investment opportunities. He's got to pick one and find the right person that he is confident in and the right products. So we're going to kind of dive into all that and also talk about some of the pitches and tailoring it versus being generic, and also the danger of potentially chasing trends if you're a founder, and a few other things in there as well. Brad, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. I guess before we dive in, Protocol VC, what type of companies do you guys invest in?
Yeah, we're an early stage fund dedicated kind of supporting computing breakthroughs with a primary focus on crypto and Web3.
Awesome. I guess we can kind of dive in with this episode just around a little bit about the cyclicality of crypto, right? So I guess talk to us a little bit about that. It is cyclical. Maybe listeners understand why, maybe they don't, but I'd love for you to kind of dive into why we've seen it be a cyclical type investment site, product.
Yeah, I mean, crypto is like notorious for being cyclical and going through kind of hype cycles and waves both on price and adoption. So I think over the last decade, they generally have coincided over a 4-year cycle with like the Bitcoin halving. And I think, I always like to use the example when my kids started kindergarten in 2021, everyone was like, oh, you're in crypto. That's super exciting. And then like the next couple of years, it was like, oh, you're still doing that crypto thing. How's that going for you? So I think, it does make it harder to kind of separate why people are building crypto in terms of, generally like as the Bitcoin price, developers tend to follow that into the market. And so figuring out, what are people kind of chasing the hype, or are they actually believe in the technology? Absolutely.
And I guess we'll come back to AI and crypto in a second, but I guess I'd kind of dive into what you mentioned. It is cyclical by nature. Still very early, it seems, from how the market looks. When you do hear about crypto projects, and there's so many of them, and I'm not sure how one actually keeps tabs on all the possible projects that are getting launched and evolving, etc. But when you as a VC are looking at these, crypto startups, how do you keep up on that landscape? How do you make sure you are seeing what's coming up and all these billions of different coins that keep, not billions, I'm exaggerating, but all these different moving parts out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the things that drew me to this space was it's very fast moving. When I initially started investing, I joined Protocol Labs, which had launched and developed Filecoin, which is a top 50 token network, and had built IPFS. And, at that point we had a couple hundred engineers on the team, which really helped kind of track trends, help diligence. I think the other advantage that crypto has that kind of Web2 doesn't necessarily have is a lot of these companies are building on blockchain. And so it's transparent, and there's the ability to kind of track adoption and leverage those signals to kind of identify companies as they start breaking out.
Absolutely. How I guess when you are hearing about a potential project and the use case, and you're trying to evaluate its opportunity and potential growth in the various factors you need to look for, I guess, could you maybe walk us through, like, what are things you're listening for? What are things you're looking for when you do hear of a crypto startup?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically crypto's had a little bit of the problem with like very smart technical people building really cool technology for a problem that no one had to some extent. And so I think looking through kind of infrastructure related investments and things like that to say, what's the actual problem you're solving? And that's not that different than Web2 early stage investing. It's like, so we want to look for companies that are leveraging Web3 primitives like decentralization or token incentives to build something that's better, faster, cheaper than the web alternative. So it's like, are you using the technology in a way that enables new use cases or new solutions for problems? Because ultimately, to be a successful crypto company, you do kind of need to cross over in most cases to appeal to Web2 users who may have kind of a view of crypto that is not necessarily positive, and so don't necessarily care about what the underlying technology is. They just care that it solves a problem for them. So looking through, thinking through, okay, well, you're very strong technically. How are you going to attract developers? How are you going to attract users? Kind of what's the go-to-market? Because a lot of times that separates. It's kind of the best projects.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess as you're kind of looking at, the founders, you're looking at their skill sets, you're looking at the problem they're trying to solve. I guess in some cases, what we've historically seen in crypto is lots of problems that necessarily don't need to be solved, or potential solutions to problems that we still haven't really found the identification for. When you look at that combination, right, the right project, the right founders, the right potential area for the crypto to exploit, I mean, how do you evaluate that intersection? Because obviously, what you just said, you have to have the right founder. They have to be able to not just be technical. They actually have to see the business problem. But also, with the way crypto is, it does tend to attract very tech forward minded people as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like, look, are you build something that enables a privacy centric application and appeals and solves a problem for people? Because I think a lot of times, if you look historically, and maybe this trend is starting to change a little bit, but consumers, for example, have never prioritized privacy, right? And so, what use case are you enabling that appeals to people, that makes their life easier rather than making them jump through a bunch of hurdles to do something that's more privacy focused? And so I think obviously there are great thinking through, all right, if you're the really strong technical founder, how are you going to build out the team that understands go-to-market? Is this founder aware of their strengths and weaknesses? I think, at the earliest stages, crypto or non-crypto, evaluating founders is relatively similar. It's kind of like, why are you building this? What's your unique insight into a growing market? Why do I think you're the right person to kind of execute on this vision? And generally speaking, it's not necessarily the market problem, because a lot of times, new products can expand an existing market, and so trying to work backwards from a total addressable market makes it difficult to evaluate the future prospects of a company. Uber, obviously not a crypto company, but it's like the canonical example of that. Sequoia passed on Uber because the SF cab market was not big enough. And obviously now Uber does more business in San Francisco than the total cab market did. So,
absolutely. I guess if you're looking at even some of the more successful crypto projects out there, right? I mean, there's a ton of them we could name. As an investor, I mean, we're seeing their market caps keep going up. I mean, they're worth more than some name brand companies out there that people that are not aware would be surprised to hear. We keep seeing these numbers grow. I guess when you as an investor look at that, I guess the real question is when you see those numbers go, the value of these cryptocurrencies, these projects are growing, and then the actual real world use cases, right? There seems to be, a lead time, right? We've talked about we're a little bit early. You still need some time for adoption. They're working on solving these problems. Is that ever a concern as a VC that these numbers are getting really far out ahead of where a traditional startup would have to talk about valuations and those type of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple answers to that. One, it's always been difficult to decouple the speculative aspect of crypto tokens from the underlying fundamentals of the company. I think generally speaking, as an early stage investor, by the time a company hits the market caps that you're discussing, we've already had an amazing return. And then from the company perspective, one of the nuances is that launching a token is essentially akin to a financing event, right? And so you get to the point where you no longer have to raise money. And by having access to the token allocation that these companies do, they can essentially fund themselves for a very long time. And so the ability to, obviously that again, you have to bet on mission-driven founders because they're now their own allocations as they start to invest will be fairly significant. But, it's the same issue for a public company. Like most public company founders, have done phenomenally well financially and are still building because they believe in the mission of the company and not necessarily because they did it to make money. So I think, one, it does provide them the financing to grow into the valuation. And I think over a longer term horizon, the hope is that the market reflects the underlying fundamentals of what the company is doing or building. Partially it's a skill set to capitalize on the speculative run up in your token to take some money off the table that you can use to go fund the company.
Absolutely. I guess if you're looking at, crypto and you're seeing the huge, emergence and growth of AI, how are they related? Are they benefiting each other? What's the relationship between crypto and AI? Because obviously they're both very, progressive technologies. I mean, is there a relationship?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of crossover. I mean, one is that decentralized, AI and decentralized compute allow you, is a good application of crypto Web3 primitives, right? Because you think about the amount of power that these foundational model companies are aggregating, and you don't necessarily know what data those models are trained on. You don't know what kind of narrative is built into the model. People generally implicitly trust a ChatGPT answer, but there's no actual reason other than believing in the company that you should do that. And so if you can leverage decentralized compute, you can know, one, you can do data verifiability, data transparency, what data is that model trained on? Why is it giving me the answer that I'm giving? And that, creates a level of trust that centralized AI companies don't have. I think the other one is that blockchain can be a pretty good hedge to the growth of AI. WorldCoin is an example of that. Proof of humanity, as bots kind of take over the internet, the ability to prove that you are indeed a human and not just do, I think most people believe that CAPTCHAs are not going to be an effective model to, combat bots in the future. And probably I don't know that they are even currently. And so I think AI and blockchain provides some hedges on AI, proving you're human, verifying the data that the models are trained on. So I think there are a lot of tailwinds for blockchain that AI creates.
I like that. Yeah, that's 100% on board with you there. I guess, we're talking a lot about very big trends here. I mean, the last two massive trends that we've seen have been, a lot of crypto and AI. I guess if you're a founder out there and you're, and you are eager to solve problems and you're thinking about where to potentially identify a problem, is there a chance that when you hear about all the emergence and growth of these type technologies, you might get biased in terms of where you're looking to solve problems? I mean, is that something that happens, or is that just, good founders kind of can block out that noise?
I mean, yes, for sure. Right. And I think it also makes it harder from an investor perspective, right? If everyone's building in the same space, then it's harder to separate, the signal from the noise in that space and understand, is this really a problem? Because if you look at the historical trends, is that in any big hype cycle, a lot of capital comes flowing in, and most of those companies go to zero, basically. But the flip side is some very foundational companies are built with that influx of capital. And so obviously from an investor perspective, you want to be in the foundational ones and not the ones that go to zero. And I think from a founder perspective, there are a lot of tailwinds from fundraising. But again, because everyone's building in a similar space, it makes it harder to separate yourself. I mean, one of the things you look at is there's a lot of really cool enterprise AI tools. And then, I think MIT, maybe it's MIT, they just study around the actual adoption of these tools is not very large. They haven't really crossed over from pilot budgets. So I think one of the things that people don't think about as a founder is okay, well, I may think that my product is really different and differentiated, but the customer that I'm selling to is looking at 15 of these tools and is not going to take the time to figure out that mine is incrementally better than the other one. They're just going to take the first one that gets in front of them and solves their problem. So thinking through what about your go-to-market is differentiated? If you're going to compete with a bunch of other products that are doing similar things, then you have to be a step function better. It's not 10% better than the existing solution is not enough to get people to change. So I think thinking through how do you separate yourself both from an investor standpoint and from a founder standpoint in terms of the go-to-market and fundraising is difficult.
Absolutely. I guess, you mentioned differentiation. When you do hear of pitches, right, where we're, talking about a lot of technologies that are still emerging, still plenty of runway to do new things, original things. There is an opportunity for obviously a founder to come in and really hone in on a pitch and almost customize it too much, be too specific to a VC, because obviously they see some benefits, potentially get into areas that cater to one VC and then go to the next one and try to do similar. And then they themselves might muddy the waters of what they're trying to actually deliver. Is there a danger, or have you seen in the past where pitches get too tailored when you're talking to founders and they're too focused on trying to hit your zone of comfort with an idea, with a pitch, with a product?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of times people want to tell investors what they want to hear and fit into the narrative that fits that investor. And I think ultimately, like, you're going to get a lot of no's from any fundraising process. And I think the goal, again, like, fundraising is a means to an end, right? Like, to build your company. It's a way to fund your, the growth of your company. And I think finding the right investors who buy into the vision that you have and not the vision that you think they want to see, the best pitches are where this is what I'm doing, and this is, and this is why I'm excited about it, and finding someone who buys into that and can push back and, help around the edges. But ultimately the best pitches are, this is what I'm doing and this is why it's exciting, right? And not, this is why I think you might think it's exciting. Because you need to build the company that you want to build and find the right investors that believe in that vision, not the vision you think they want.
Yeah, I 100%. I think it's almost like I prefer to get a no because someone doesn't buy into what I believe I can do or what I can bring to the table, versus getting a yes because I've said something that they're interested in hearing, and then I have to go deliver on what they want. And it's not like that I'm going to go back and have them in every conversation. So all of a sudden now I'm building for somebody's likes and desires, and I feel that's a big danger. Across the companies you guys typically invest in and obviously participate in these various early stage rounds, how far are you comfortable, especially around pivoting? Like, we had the notion of companies obviously will pivot a little bit, and product market fit, all those things. Should VCs care? If they do, how far should they care? Because the pivoting does happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately we're backing the founder, and I think very few founders have like a pre-seed pitch that actually ends up being the company that they build. I was actually at a previous fund, I was an investor in Remitly, which is a remittances company that went public. And when they went public, I resent the pre-seed deck to Matt, the founder. And I was like, you're like one of the very few people that like his actual vision was accomplished, and he didn't really iterate, he iterated obviously to get to product market fit, but he didn't really pivot the vision. Ultimately, I think, the job of a founder is to find product market fit, and it may not necessarily come from the original way that you thought it would. And, a pre-seed pitch is essentially an hypothesis. Like, I believe that this is a problem, and I've validated it to some extent, but not fully. Because until you have product market fit, you don't really have like a business. And I think the role of investors is to help people get there. I also think, like, to your point, fitting a narrative, like, people overestimate how good investors' advice is. I think generally when I try and give advice, it's like, here's what I think based on, pattern matching and experience across like 200 companies. But ultimately, like, I'm not at your company every day. This is your vision and your company. And so you can synthesize advice from a bunch of different places, but overcorrecting based on someone's advice is tough. Because I think, that's the other thing, is like, you want to back founders that are stubborn enough to take a bunch of no's and have people tell them that their idea is stupid, but also flexible enough to know where they aren't strong and to iterate based on feedback. And so it's like, how do you synthesize advice and figure out what resonates and what doesn't? But ultimately, it's the founder's decision on what they build.
Absolutely. It's interesting. And this question might be, you putting on your, looking at your crystal ball type question, but obviously we talked about crypto. We talked about the emergence of AI. It seems like a very good fit. AI is, led to agentic. We're seeing robotics come up on the horizon. We're seeing opportunities for humans to kind of, be in the loop, but also take a step back. Obviously, who knows where all this will go, so not going to hold you to it. But as you're kind of looking at your investments and what you're looking for, do you yourself start thinking ahead and start seeing where you think the trend's going and start mapping to the founders that might be looking at that? Because there's going to be opportunities that we haven't even thought about, discussed. I mean, all this agentic conversation and all these AIs that'll be out there, they all will have to do a lot of X, Y, and Z, and some of that seems like it's ripe for crypto. But again, you'd be trying to also forecast the future on some of those bets.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, I'm more of a thematic than thesis-driven investor, where I think I just need to know enough about the market to know that you as a founder, have a unique insight to validate that insight. But I also think you need to think about what are the second order and first order implications of the growth of AI? Where does that leave us in 3 to 5 years? And how does that impact the companies I'm investing in now? Protocol Labs itself, which we spun out of, has always organized itself around new computing breakthroughs. So has done a bunch of neurotech investing in terms of brain computer interfaces and things like that kind of merge AI and humanity to some extent, which is kind of a wild future to think about. But I think thinking through what is the role of humans if AI hits AGI or in the not too distant future, and how do you think through that is a kind of an important role of investor? You don't necessarily have to be correct, but you need to have a prepared mind to think about those implications.
Absolutely. And maybe a final question. I haven't asked a VC this question before, but I am curious. I know obviously power law and VCs is what every VC will talk about. I guess the question is some of those results take time, right? From your perspective, from your own, I guess, metrics, your own evaluation of if you're trending towards success. How do you approach that, right? Because obviously a lot of the stuff does take time, right? Obviously there's a lot of metrics, you're taking data points, but for you yourself to kind of feel like, you're heading in the right direction, you're making the right investments. Are there things that you do to help yourself evaluate just the quarter to quarter versus the longer term macros that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking back at your pre-investment decision making and why did we make this investment? What was I thinking at the time? What was the thesis behind that? And then validating that as, the future builds. It makes me feel old, but I've been early stage investing for 15 years now. And so do have some pattern matching on what kind of mistakes did you make? How did you think about that investment and why didn't it work out? I mean, ultimately, I think it always comes down to betting on the right founder, because the founder is really the driving force behind the success of the company in 99.9% of the cases. And I think to your point, being too early is just basically being wrong, right? And so I think if you're going to invest in frontier tech, thinking about what is the commercialization path for these things? How do I think about these getting mainstream adoption? What is the path to product market fit? And is there an intermediate path for a different market that you can kind of iterate on to get to where in some cases for crypto technology, you're waiting on the hardware to catch up or for compute, you're waiting on the hardware to catch up. And what's an example of, that you can spend 18 months in this kind of go to market and learn things while you wait for the hardware to catch up? Is try not to bet your company on an unknown, right? Where you can't control the outcome. Makes it really difficult.
Absolutely. Sorry, maybe last question. Definitely last question, but I am kind of curious because you obviously mentioned investing early, and I guess you have less data points, obviously smaller investments early. I mean, all those things make sense. You mentioned obviously, some of this stuff is is out. We gotta, go with the themes we believe in, invest in the founders we believe in, and the problems they're trying to solve. When you are evaluating founders, when it's really early, a lot of times they don't have a ton of work experience either. What are there traits? Are there things that you look for? Because, the halo effect can come into play. Obviously, there's some founders that will look the part, but not obviously be the part. Are there things you look for that kind of you've seen in the last 15 years that signal the right type of founder for you?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's just grit, right? Like, and being mission driven. Like, why are you doing this? Is this something that you feel like you need to see exist in the world? Because ultimately, if you kind of just like wander through the idea maze and come across something that you think may not be an idea, maybe a good idea, but you're not super passionate about it, it's just like very, very, very difficult to found a successful company. And most people fail, and whether they have grit or not, right? And I think being able to ride the ups and downs of the founder journey is really important. And so, have you overcome things in your past that maybe you don't have the like canonical work experience to start a crypto company or start a company in general. Like you didn't, you weren't one of the first 10 employees of Stripe or whatever. But I think figuring out, is there something in this person's background that makes me think they are going to be able to like push through the ups and downs of being a founder, and thinking about like, what is their motivation for starting this company? Because ultimately, if you're not passionate about whatever that motivation is, then you're probably going to give up at some point.
Absolutely. Love it. I really appreciate your time, insights. If someone does have a follow-up question, something you mentioned on the show, is there a good way of touching base with you?
Yeah, I would say LinkedIn or Twitter is the easiest way to get in touch with me. If you're a crypto person, I also have Telegram.
Absolutely. All right, Brad, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think we talked a lot about obviously crypto and some of its cyclical nature and how it's complementary to AI, and talked about early stage founders and what Brad looks in those founders and the dangers of actually getting too cute with your pitches and trying to customize and appease various VCs. A lot of advice in there for founders or somebody who's interested in starting a company. So please share this episode with somebody who might benefit from it. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.